Por favor, en la pantalla en unos momentos va a aparecer un globo, un mapa mundo. Presionen ese botón para seleccionar español, Spanish, y de esa manera pueden escuchar en interpretación simultánea la plática de esta noche.
Thank you. So, as all of you know, the Civil Rights Division recently announced the conclusion of our investigation of the Memphis Police Department and the city of Memphis. Last week, we issued a public findings report that describes the police department's and the city's violations of federal law. We have met with many of you throughout this investigation, and we want to thank you for sharing the perspectives and experiences that you have about public safety in your city. We know that doing so is not always easy, and this investigation could not have been completed without your help. Our goal for this evening is to give you an overview of how we conducted the investigation and to walk you through our main findings and the root causes that we identified for those violations. The report is available online, and I encourage you all to read it when you have some time. We're putting the link in the chat, and that should pull up the report. We know that many of you have not had a chance yet to review the report, and we want you to know that this is also not your last chance to hear from us or to interact with us. We're going to be continuing to hold meetings, Zoom meetings, and also in-person community meetings throughout this process. And you can continue reaching out to us as well through the community inbox information, and we'll put that into the chat. And we are planning to be back in Memphis next week to hold an in-person community meeting on December 18th. And we're going to send out more information about that community meeting and how to register by email in the next day or so. We look forward to seeing many of you there and having more conversations about the future of the public safety systems here in Memphis. I want to start by saying just a few words about how we conducted our investigation. So the team that conducted this investigation, some of whom are on the Zoom screen that you see right now, our team includes attorneys, investigators, and support staff from the Special Litigation Section of the Civil Rights Division in Washington, D.C., along with attorneys from the United States Attorney's Office for the Western District of Tennessee. Congress gave the Justice Department the authority to address law enforcement officers that violate people's rights. And one of the ways in which the Justice Department does that is through what is called a pattern or practice investigation. That is what we do. Our investigations are civil investigations. They are not criminal investigations. We do not prosecute officers for crimes. Instead, we look at a department as a whole, and we look to see if there are systemic issues that result in regular violations of people's rights. Congress authorized the Justice Department to address these issues when we find there is reasonable cause to believe that law enforcement officers engaged in a pattern or practice of conduct. We can bring a lawsuit to eliminate the pattern or practice, or we can enter into a settlement that mandates reforms to address the violations and the causes of them. We have a long track record that we are proud of being able to work cooperatively with jurisdictions to address issues and look to the future. When we opened this investigation, we told the community, we told the city, and we told the police department that our investigation would be thorough and objective. And I can tell you that it has been. Our investigation has been comprehensive. Our team spent nearly a year and a half, 17 months, investigating the city of Memphis and the Memphis Police Department. To conduct our investigation, our team worked alongside about a dozen experts in the areas of police department management, use of force, statistics, accountability, 911 call taking and dispatch, and the response to people with behavioral health disabilities. We also reviewed information that we got from the city and from outside sources. We reviewed hundreds of incidents between individuals and Memphis police officers, including hundreds of hours of body-worn camera footage and thousands of documents, including policies and training materials, police reports, and internal affairs files. We also conducted rigorous statistical analyses of the data that the city and MPD reported between 2018 and 2023 on calls for service, stops, uses of force, and other officer activities. We also spent a lot of time with dedicated Memphis police officers, supervisors, and commanders. We went on ride-alongs with officers in every precinct and during every shift. We interviewed officers from specialized units, from the training academy, from the Inspectional Services Bureau. We toured the 911 Communications Center, and we spoke with call takers and dispatchers. And all of these people play an essential role in Memphis's public safety systems. We know that despite our findings, there are many MPD officers who are dedicated professionals, and we met with them and we heard from them, and we appreciate their candid reactions to the public safety systems here in Memphis. We spoke with dozens of officers and city officials who are committed to serving people here in Memphis with thoughtfulness and respect. Ensuring public safety here in Memphis presents some unique challenges. Officers have often been tasked with taking the lead to address issues that are better handled outside of the criminal justice system altogether. And we want to acknowledge their efforts. They provide vital services. I also want to say that the city fully cooperated with our investigation, which is one of the reasons we were able to complete it expeditiously. We were granted access to some important materials right away, such as body-worn camera footage, which allowed us to move quickly. Still, I want to emphasize that the people who worked on this investigation worked very hard. Before we get into the details, I want to turn it over to Suraj Kumar, who is our lead attorney, and who will provide a brief overview of the findings. And then we can get into some questions from you all.
Good evening. My name is Suraj Kumar, and I'm a trial attorney in the Civil Rights Division at the Department of Justice. I'm the lead attorney for the Memphis police investigation. The Justice Department has concluded that there's reasonable cause to believe that MPD and the city engage in a pattern or practice of conduct that violates federal law and the United States Constitution. We made a number of findings, including that MPD uses excessive force. MPD makes unlawful stops, searches, and arrests, especially after traffic stops and for minor offenses. MPD unlawfully discriminates against Black people in its enforcement activities. And the city and MPD unlawfully discriminate against people with behavioral health disabilities. In our report, we also describe serious concerns we have about MPD's treatment of children and the harm to their well-being. The violations we found were caused by persistent deficiencies in policy, training, supervision, and accountability within the police department and the city. That's just an overview of our findings, but it's important to make clear that these findings are not based on any one incident or event. Instead, they're based on evidence showing long-standing problems at MPD, problems rooted in the failure of leadership, supervision, and accountability. This pattern or practice of unlawful conduct that we found compromises the city's and MPD's ability to provide public safety services safely, constitutionally, and effectively. I also want to mention something that's at the very end of our report, recommended remedial measures. That part of the report outlines solutions to some of the issues that you'll hear about in a moment. But these are just the starting point. We hope to work with the city to enact the necessary reforms to address the violations we found. That will take a lot of work. But these problems are solvable, and we've seen real changes in cities and police departments across the country. Our recommendations described in the report are changes that are needed to reform the police department and the city and to address the legal violations we found. But as I said, they're just a starting point, and part of this process is engaging with the Memphis community, just as we did during the investigation. We also want to do so going forward as we work or try to work with the city to address the problems we found. So I'll turn it over to Kit to describe the ways the community can continue to stay involved in the next steps in the process.
Thank you, Suraj, and thank you all for joining us this evening. My name is Kit Reese. I am a civil rights investigator at the Civil Rights Division for the Department of Justice. I want to echo the thanks that Mo and Suraj passed along. I hope for those of you who've read the report, you see yourselves and your stories in there the way that you shared them with us. What you contributed to the investigation and to the findings report was invaluable. This wouldn't be the story of Memphis without the story of the people in Memphis. We've had the privilege of spending time in the community in person and virtually throughout the investigation. We heard from many community members and local organizations. We heard from people who worked at convenience stores. We heard from people who worked at hospitals and homeless shelters. And we travel around the city in our tours in Memphis and also virtually through small community meetings. I look forward to moving forward with this investigation. We hope to hear from those of you at our community meetings next week and continue gathering feedback about the reform. We believe the systemic problems we've seen in Memphis require structural reform and accountability. To ensure that a consent decree is as powerful and as effective as it needs to be, we need to continue hearing from you. We'll continue reaching out to hear your thoughts about the kind of police department you want for your city. You can see our number and email address there in the chat. That goes right to our community inbox. I'm seeing one question. We are going to get to more questions at the end, but this one relates to what I'm saying now. I'm seeing, will you have availability to meet with residents privately? And yes, if you reach out to our community inbox, you can request conversations with us and we can talk to you over Zoom or over the phone with a lot of flexibility. So please go ahead and reach out to us about what you saw in the report, what you're continuing to experience, and what you want the Memphis Police Department to look like. Now, the rest of the team will go through each area of our investigation and summarize what we found. We'll start with our findings regarding excessive force, and I'll turn things over to my colleague, Juliana.
My name is Juliana Astorita, and I am a trial attorney at the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice. We found that MPD uses excessive force in violation of the Fourth Amendment. That pattern is widespread and not limited to any specific kind of force. While addressing violent crime is a challenge in Memphis, we understand the pressure that officers face, but a significant share of the unreasonable force that we found was during police encounters for nonviolent offenses, such as traffic offenses or shoplifting. Officers use force when people are not physically resisting or posing a threat to officers or others. They use force to retaliate against people who criticize or talk back to the police. Officers escalate situations, especially after low-level offenses and traffic stops, and they use force that is unwarranted or disproportionate under the circumstances. In one incident, officers choked, pepper sprayed, and tased a man 5 times after he tried to shoplift a soft drink from a gas station. MPD officers use unjustified neck restraints, including chokeholds, on restrained or handcuffed people, people suspected of minor offenses like littering, and people exhibiting symptoms of behavioral health crisis. Officers failed to report over 90% of the neck restraints that we identified. Officers unreasonably use less lethal force, including tasers and pepper spray, against people who are not physically resisting. This is especially troubling because the only officers who had tasers during the period of our review were crisis intervention officers who are specially trained in de-escalation. Officers use force against people who have surrendered or are restrained. Supervisors approved these uses of force in nearly every incident we reviewed. We also found problems with the MPD's use of firearms. Officers unreasonably fire at or into vehicles when they're not in danger and without regard for the safety of other officers and civilians. MPD's policies and training do not provide clear guidance on when and how it is appropriate to use force. For example, MPD training does not adequately instruct officers on de-escalation tactics that can be used to avoid force. MPD lacks accountability, and its supervision of line officers is inadequate. Supervisors do not hold officers accountable for using excessive force. We found that supervisors rarely identify excessive force, even when it is clearly depicted in body-worn camera video. And the Inspectional Services Bureau also fails to identify unreasonable force. The lack of meaningful oversight validates and reinforces unlawful practices. Our report specifically identifies certain steps that MPD should take to end this pattern of excessive force, including improving their policies and training and enhancing oversight. MPD has already taken some important steps in this regard, including revising its use of force policy. We have seen these reforms reduce both serious force and overall force in other cities. MPD must also improve its investigations into uses of force because without accountability, policy change is not enough to eliminate the pattern or practice. I will now turn it over to my colleague, Emily Keller, who will discuss our findings regarding stops, searches, and arrests.
Thank you. My name is Emily Keller, and I'm a trial attorney in the Civil Rights Division at the Department of Justice. We found that MPD makes stops, searches, and arrests that violate the Fourth Amendment. First, we found that MPD makes unconstitutional stops. MPD makes unconstitutional stops of pedestrians and drivers without reasonable articulable suspicion. MPD has decided to emphasize traffic enforcement while failing to properly supervise officers and review the strategy for its impact and effectiveness. MPD officers face pressure to make stops, and many of these stops involve equipment or documentation violations, like expired tags or broken taillights. From 2018 to 2023, more than half of MPD's citations involved these types of violations. MPD officers routinely handcuff and detain people in their patrol vehicles during stops without any reason to believe that the person poses a danger or a flight risk. Due to minimal supervision of officer stops, officers who make unlawful stops are rarely caught unless someone files a complaint. And even when community members complain, reviewers fail to identify violations and fail to discipline officers for this unlawful conduct. Second, MPD searches people unlawfully. We found that MPD officers regularly conduct unreasonable frisks or searches of people. Officers regularly order drivers out of their cars and frisk them for weapons without justification to believe that the person is armed and dangerous. They also frisk and search people without sufficient justification after stopping them on the street. MPD does not require officers to document frisks or searches, preventing effective supervision. And even when officers do record their actions, they often don't cite specific facts supporting their conduct. Third, MPD unlawfully searches and seizes cars. MPD officers illegally search people's vehicles during traffic stops for minor violations. When officers seek consent to search vehicles, they will conduct searches even when consent is denied, and they will seek consent to search under coercive circumstances. Officers also tow cars that are legally parked or when family members or other licensed drivers are available to drive the car, contrary to MPD's own policies. Recovering a car is expensive and difficult and can cost more than the value of the car itself. And yet, in spite of that, MPD impounds hundreds of cars each month. Finally, we found that MPD conducts unlawful arrests. MPD officers make unlawful arrests for nonviolent misdemeanor offenses without probable cause, at times in apparent retaliation or to justify the officer's own conduct. For example, officers unlawfully arrest people for disorderly conduct, even when the people are complying with officers' instructions and are not threatening or dangerous, including when they talk back to or criticize officers. These unlawful practices with respect to stops, searches, and arrests can result in stigma, trauma, loss of employment, loss of transportation, and separation from families for people who are arrested, as well as loss of trust in the police department as a whole. I will now turn it over to Serge to address our racial discrimination findings.
We have reasonable cause to believe that MPD engages in racial discrimination in its enforcement activities. We examined MPD's enforcement of low-level minor offenses like traffic violations. We conducted rigorous statistical analyses. We found that MPD treats Black people differently from white people when they engage in similar conduct. MPD enforces the law differently in Black neighborhoods and against Black people. This finding is based on statistical analyses that compare Black people to similarly situated white people, according to officers' own descriptions of people's conduct. For example, MPD's traffic enforcement is more intense where Black people live, but this is not justified by a greater risk of traffic crashes in Black neighborhoods. We also found that while public health data shows that Black people and white people use marijuana at similar rates, MPD cites or arrests Black adults at 5.2 times the rate of white people. Discriminatory policing in Memphis is driven by MPD's traffic-based saturation strategy, flooding Black neighborhoods with intense enforcement of traffic and other nonviolent offenses. This strategy results in Black people being treated more harshly than similarly situated white people. That violates the law. Now, traffic enforcement can be part of an effective public safety strategy, but city and law enforcement leaders must assess their practices and make changes where necessary. In our report, we've identified steps that MPD can take to address discriminatory and unlawful practices, including unlawful stop searches and arrests, which Emily described just a minute ago. We believe these violations are closely linked and can be addressed by the same kinds of remedies. For example, MPD should revise policies and training on stops, searches, and arrests so that officers understand the constitutional limits on their authority, and MPD should improve data collection and supervision. By collecting more data and using it to drive changes in enforcement practices, MPD can reduce the kind of officer activity that leads to racial disparities without producing any public safety benefits. MPD and the city can also strengthen efforts to address violent crime and ensure that officers are spending their time to serve that important public safety mission. I'll now turn it over to Haley to discuss our findings under the Americans with Disabilities Act.
Good evening. My name is Haley Van Arum, and I'm a trial attorney at the Civil Rights Division at the Department of Justice. We found that the City of Memphis and Memphis Police Department violate the Americans with Disabilities Act by discriminating against people with behavioral health disabilities when providing emergency response services. To evaluate the city's and MPD's compliance with the ADA, we worked with experts in 911 dispatch, behavioral health services, and crisis response to analyze 911 calls and police incidents involving behavioral health. We also reviewed how MPD officers respond to behavioral health emergencies. We found violations of the ADA, both because MPD sends law enforcement officers to respond to behavioral health crisis unnecessarily, and in how MPD officers respond. I'll first discuss the unnecessary response of MPD officers. So between 2018 and 2023, call takers classified about 75% of behavioral health calls in Memphis as nonviolent and unarmed. And we found that many of these behavioral health calls did not require a police response, but they received a police response. The city offers only limited ways for behavioral health professionals to respond to 911 calls. Mobile crisis services cannot be dispatched from 911 or the crisis hotline and will not respond to any behavioral health calls without police. In addition, by policy, MPD sends more officers to nonviolent mental health calls than to 911 calls that squarely present a risk of violence. For example, dispatchers send a minimum of 3 officers to every mental consumer call, but may send only 1 officer to a call about a criminal assault or 2 officers for robberies in progress or shots fired. This all leads to Memphis sending a law enforcement response to many behavioral health calls when it is not needed. Second, we found that when MPD officers respond to behavioral health calls, they seldom make reasonable modifications to their approach when appropriate. We reviewed people who appeared to be experiencing behavioral health crisis and saw that officers used unreasonable force in a significant portion of those incidents. In other incidents we reviewed, officers mocked or demeaned people with disabilities or acted on harmful stereotypes. Officers knew or should have known the person had a disability. Excuse me. And could have safely made reasonable modifications, such as calling in the assistance of a mobile crisis team or the city's co-response team, which is called the CARE team, or using effective de-escalation techniques. And we know that MPD and city leadership do care about these issues, and MPD established the Crisis Intervention Program decades ago. This is known as the CIT program. But our investigation revealed serious problems with the CIT program. We found that CIT officers often escalate encounters and use combative tactics almost immediately after arriving to behavioral health calls. We reviewed incidents in which CIT officers used excessive force on and screamed at an 8-year-old child with behavioral health disabilities. We reviewed other incidents in which CIT officers used tasers on unarmed and nonviolent individuals experiencing behavioral health crisis. And we saw CIT officers threatening and verbally abusing individuals experiencing behavioral health crises. Now, the city and MPD can make reasonable modifications to avoid discriminating against people with behavioral health disabilities. They can expand the city's co-response team, known as the CARE team, which currently has limited eligibility and hours, to provide a joint response to behavioral health calls that would be appropriate for a response by both police and behavioral health professionals. They can also modify dispatching policies so that a behavioral health responders can respond without law enforcement to behavioral health calls that do not pose a safety risk. This can be done in a measured way that appropriately scales up the response over time. This would lead to better outcomes for people with behavioral health disabilities, and it would allow officers to spend more time on calls that present a greater risk of violence or on proactive community policing efforts. The city and MPD can also regularly monitor and evaluate the CIT program, hold CIT officers accountable for excessive force and other mistreatment of people with behavioral health disabilities. So our findings also discuss serious concern about MPD's practices and the impact on children. Next, Emily will discuss those findings.
Thank you, Haley. The report identifies a concern that MPD does not take into account the vulnerability of children and their stage of development when MPD officers interact with children. Many of the incidents that we reviewed in all areas of our investigation involve children, and these incidents raise special concerns. Specifically, we found that MPD officers escalate encounters with children by using combative language and needless force, including during incidents where children are in crisis. Our findings also describe MPD's troubling interrogation practices with children, including lying to children, making false promises, and making threats, tactics that are coercive and can lead to involuntary and false confessions. These are problems that can be solved through clearer policies and with training for officers on interactions with children and youth. Now, Suraj will discuss contributing causes to the violations that we found.
Thanks, Emily. In addition to the violations my colleagues have described, we identified several contributing causes to the violations. We've concluded that MPD lacks effective systems to provide officers close and effective supervision and to hold officers accountable for misconduct. For example, MPD policies don't provide officers with appropriate standards on when to use force or conduct searches. MPD supervisors fail to ensure that officers follow departmental policies when it comes to use of force or stop searches and arrests. We also find that MPD supervisors fail to identify or investigate misconduct. Supervisors don't consistently accept, document, or investigate misconduct complaints. In one incident, a Black woman was rear-ended by a white driver, and an officer cursed at her and threatened to arrest her for disorderly conduct, even though she had done nothing illegal. An MPD supervisor exonerated the officer and wrote incorrectly that the woman, quote, provoked officers to address her behavior. The woman wrote in her complaint, quote, I felt as if I were not a citizen of the USA. We found that MPD fails to conduct thorough and fair investigations into alleged misconduct by officers. This addresses a question that I saw in the chat about whether our investigation looked at internal affairs investigations into allegations of misconduct. The answer to that question is yes. MPD's misconduct investigations are not thorough and objective, and investigators sometimes ask leading questions that justify officer conduct. Even when MPD finds policy violations, the disciplinary process can undermine those findings and minimize misconduct. This deficient accountability system results in officers engaging in repeated misconduct. Now, as we've identified some of the root causes of the violations we found, we also talk about in our report some potential remedial measures to address the violations. And we've talked about some of them throughout this presentation. Our focus in the Department of Justice is on finding solutions to the problems we identified, and some of which we've described tonight. We're committed to working with the city and MPD to negotiate an agreement that will provide a roadmap to address the violations and hold the police department and the city accountable for making changes. In our experience, the most effective way to bring a police department in compliance with the Constitution and federal law is through an agreement that is enforceable and overseen by an independent monitor who can report out on whether MPD is doing what the agreement requires. We have agreements with Baltimore, Newark, and Seattle, among other cities. All of these cities have seen real and sustained improvements in public safety. In Seattle, the police department has reduced its use of force in behavioral crisis incidents to less than 2% of such incidents. Most of the force used by the police department is low level. In Baltimore, there were 11 reported injuries in over 16,000 transports after an investigation into the police department that was opened after the death of Freddie Gray. In 2022 in Baltimore, use of force incidents decreased by 62%. And Baltimore has also seen a significant decrease in people being arrested and then released without charges, an end to some of the unlawful stop, search, and arrest practices that we found in our investigation. Finally, in Newark, the police department consistently conducts stops in compliance with the Constitution. These efforts have been successful at reducing the burden on law enforcement and reducing crime. Crime is down 40% between 2016 and 2022, and Newark entered the consent decree in 2016. Now that the city, MPD, and the Memphis community had the opportunity to review the report, we hope the city and MPD will work with us to negotiate reforms that will address the violations and rebuild community trust. The community has played a critical role in our investigation, and your involvement is again critical at this stage. As we acknowledged in our report, Memphis has a long civil rights and advocacy history, and we hope that advocacy will continue. Your input is essential to set priorities for public safety in Memphis and hold the city and MPD accountable. I'll turn over to Kit to talk a little bit more about opportunities for community involvement.
Yes, thank you, Suraj. So as we go forward with this, we're going to be continuing to have community meetings. I see some familiar names for people who joined our meetings during the investigation. Some of those meetings will look very similar in small conversation style, where we talk about the findings report and try to get feedback from you. This is also an opportunity for you to let us know what you want to see in the specific remedies that you're interested in. Read the report, see the findings, let us know, and shoot us an email. This could include changes to policy, training, or the creation of new systems or rules that could curtail unconstitutional behavior. As Mo said earlier, our first in-person public meeting will be next Wednesday, the 18th, at the National Civil Rights Museum. If you'd like to receive more information about it, send us your email here. We'll be announcing things like the time, and we'll have Spanish and ASL interpretation provided. We know many of you have not had a chance to read the full report yet, and we know that you may have even more questions after talking with us, but we want to start addressing what we have seen so far. Okay. Some of these questions are worded a little differently, but sort of ask similar things. So if you don't hear yours exactly, we're probably sort of addressing it with similar ones. One general question we're seeing a lot is, How much will reform cost the city of Memphis, and who pays for it? Mo, do you want to take that one?
Sure, I can take that one. And I just want to say too, there's nearly 400 people who joined this Zoom. And again, that's incredible. We're so grateful for you taking the time this evening to join us. But I think we're probably not going to be able to get through all of the questions. But if you write the question in the chat, we can try to get back to you as well. And, hopefully we'll be able to address some of the questions next week as well, and in ongoing conversations. But so we've heard this question a fair amount about the cost of reform. And I want to be clear that, there is a cost for constitutional policing, particularly in a place where there are systemic problems that are going to take time to address. The city does bear the cost of implementing the reforms. And there's also a lot of human costs in the sense of moving things forward and taking the time to do the hard work of reform. The costs of reform do depend on a variety of factors, however. So, for example, the details of the reforms and the time that it takes for the city to start implementing the reforms. Sometimes cities begin right away, other times it takes longer. The process does require a commitment of resources by the city, but there are really significant benefits to investing in those reforms. And in our view, those benefits significantly outweigh the financial costs. There is an enormous human cost to not reforming, of course. We all have basic civil rights, and we all are entitled to those civil rights and should not have to give them up. We expect law enforcement agencies to honor those rights. And when police violate those civil rights, that is a significant burden on families. That is a significant burden on communities. And these violations can cause injuries and death. I think the other cost is that the city, there is a loss of trust in law enforcement. And that trust is really essential to addressing public safety challenges like crime. Community-based violence prevention we've seen it work in other places. And for that to work, it's really essential that there is a trust that is built up. Cities also pay millions of dollars to settle police misconduct cases, and we've seen sustained reforms reduce those costs significantly. Now, at the Justice Department, we are also part of this process. We are on the ground implementing the reforms alongside the city. We bring in our own experts at DOJ's expense to provide technical assistance and help cities and police departments learn how to use their own resources more efficiently, lawfully, and effectively. And we also include elements in our agreements to control the costs. So, for example, we have caps on the amount of money that monitors can charge to provide the really essential independent oversight to ensure that police departments are actually doing what they say. But there are ways to control those costs. And another requirement that we typically include is a constant reassessment of a city's progress and identifying successes along the way. So where there can be a reduction in resources paid towards the implementation, we can acknowledge that along the way.
Thanks, Mo. I'm going to answer, I see 2 questions about the community that are almost related. One of them was from someone who's asking, essentially, how do we decide what residents to speak with in the course of our investigation? So I'll talk about that briefly, and then I'll get into the questions about what the community can do to support change in Memphis. There's a number of ways we decide who to speak to when we open investigations. We do, I think the question asked if we spoke to community organizations or random people. We speak to both community organizations and random people. It's a combination of doing research and outreach when we open a case, and then we'll often ask people we meet with who else we should meet with. So that's one way. We also get information about potential incidents from the records that Memphis turns over. So sometimes we meet people through the course of looking into those incidents. And it's also an important part of our investigation to just canvass, to walk around with our flyers and make sure we're accessible to people there. So I see some people here who I've met passing out those flyers. We do try to make sure that our physical meetings are spaced evenly across the city. So in the course of the investigation, we had some evening town halls, and then we also had daytime library tabling events at different more smaller local library branches throughout the city. If there's ever a way where, if you missed us in the investigation and think there's a way that we could be reaching people better, that's something we would love to hear about. You can email our community inbox and write attention Kit, or any of us who you'd like to speak with. And as far as what the community can do to continue supporting change in Memphis, there's a lot of moving parts right now. And, I know it's frustrating to not hear us come here with the checklist or something like that about what the next steps are going to look like. And that's one of the things that's so challenging about collaborative work, that we have to be in a discussion about what the next steps look like. But the community essentially can first get involved in giving feedback about the remedial measures and our findings report. If you have more specific things than what we listed, we want to hear what those are. If you think something we listed is a terrible idea for Memphis, that's certainly something we want to know about before we, really start talking about it more. So give us your feedback via email, come to our meetings. Those are the first steps for now. And then we'll continue to advocate for community involvement as we look further. And we don't have too much time, but if you want to talk more about this, or you're curious about what it looked like in other cities, again, email our community inbox, mention any of us specifically if there's one of us you'd like to talk to in particular, and we can sort of talk about what other cities have done, what Memphis looks like, and what your ideas are. Okay, I'm going to switch to another topic that we're seeing. The city said that this investigation was faster than DOJ's investigations of other police departments. Is that true? Mo, do you want to take that one as well?
Sure, I can take that one. I think there are a lot of factors that go into how long it takes to conduct an investigation. Some of our investigations are into very small police departments with just a half a dozen officers, for example, and other investigations are into much larger police departments the size of Memphis PD, and police departments that are much larger even. And so that is a factor that has something to do with the time. I think here, I would say that this investigation was comprehensive. We watched hundreds of hours of body camera. We reviewed thousands of documents. We spoke to dozens of people. We spoke to dozens of officers. We really set out to get a full picture of the Memphis Police Department's activities, and we believe that we have, and our report reflects that thorough investigation. I will say that the city fully cooperated with our investigation, as I said at the beginning, and that cooperation really allowed us to have the access to get the kinds of perspectives that are so important to understanding the full story. So we were able to speak with officers and ride with them, and we were able to very quickly after we opened our investigation access body camera, and that allowed us to start reviewing incidents very quickly. And I think the other thing I will say again is that the people on the team, some of whom are here today, worked very, very hard because this is a very important case for the Justice Department. We want to address these issues. We want to move as quickly as we can to address these issues because we know that the uncertainty and the harms that people can experience are very severe. So I hope that answers the question.
So much. And again, if we don't answer your question fully, please write back to us and we can continue the conversation. I see this is also sort of a broad question. So Suraj, I'll give this to you. Where do things currently stand between the city and DOJ?
Happy to address that. Our report came out last week. We're glad the report is out, and the city, MPD, and the community have an opportunity to review it. Not just the evidence and the facts detailing the violations, but also the remedies that we've proposed to address those violations. And we look forward to engaging with the city to negotiate reforms that will address our findings. The city and MPD haven't waited on our findings to make changes, and we talk about those changes in our report. But more work is needed. These violations are serious, and they've persisted for years. In most of our cases in the Department of Justice, we've been able to resolve our findings collaboratively with cities across the country, and we plan to do so here. There was a question about what collaboration might look like. Well, first, we would seek to negotiate a reform agreement with enforceable provisions that would commit the city and MPD to making changes. We would work with the city to solve practical problems about implementation. We would work with the city to revise policies to make sure that they line up with the constitutional standards, to revise training and make sure that training is actually benefiting officers, that it's engaging training, that they're actually learning practical skills from. We would work with the city and MPD to make sure the changes are implemented in a timely way. And we would want to work with the city to make sure that the solutions are building on the systems that are here, that the solutions are being implemented in an effective and an efficient way. We've been able to do that in other cases, and we're ready to work with the city and the police department to do that here. As I said, we've seen this approach lead not only to more constitutional policing, but also more effective policing. Those two things go hand in hand. There was a question about, the data in Newark showing a decrease in crime, and whether that was just because the police department was making fewer arrests. As I said, constitutional policing goes hand in hand with effective policing, and the reality is from 2016 to 2022. Violent crime dropped significantly in Newark at the same time that the city was implementing reforms to ensure constitutional stop searches and arrests. What we found here in many cases in stop searches and arrests that we reviewed is that the violations, the unlawful conduct, often led to prosecutors declining to bring charges or courts dismissing cases. And that doesn't serve public safety. And so what's needed here are changes, which we've begun to outline in the report, to make sure that officers are adhering to the law and serving the community.
Suraj, that touched on a question, and someone was asking about crime going down in New York and Baltimore. So thank you for speaking to that. And again, reach out if you'd like to talk about any of this more. There's something else about the next steps here that maybe we can just add some more detail to before we wind down for the night. It says, when you say work with, what exactly does that mean? Who writes the plan? Is there real collaboration? Suraj, do you think you can take, or Mo, you can take that one?
Go ahead.
Sure.
Suraj.
So, some of this is going to depend on what kind of agreement we can come to. But I will say, certainly part of it will be, if we're able to come to some kind of agreement, people from DOJ working with people from the city or MPD. But a really important part of change is going to come from the community's continued engagement in the process. One of the other benefits of a reform agreement that we've seen is increased transparency and the ability for people in the community to participate in shaping the public safety priorities of their city. That means the ability to comment on policies and training. It could mean more data transparency so that people can see what kind of activities the police department is engaged in around traffic enforcement or uses of force. And so, I think collaboration could look very different depending on the kinds of areas that are being addressed. But, we couldn't have done the investigation without people in the community. And that's also going to be true if we're going to address the violations that we found. The community is going to play a really important role in any collaboration that we see next.
Thanks so much. And Mo, I'll give this question to you again. There's a number of questions about basically the presidential administration changing. And I think one of them was something like, will this DOJ team change when there's an administration change?
So we've been getting that question a lot, and I completely understand why we're getting it. I think everybody that you're seeing on this screen, we are all career attorneys who work for the Justice Department across administrations. Several of us have worked across multiple administrations. I've worked personally across 3 administrations and have done really important work in all 3 of those in administrations. And I think the way that our office is set up is to promote that consistency across administrations. Now, I mean, obviously every administration is different, and we can't say for sure one way or another what the next administration will want to do. But all of us are career attorneys, and we are going to be moving forward with this case. Certainly this evening is just the beginning, and we really do need to hear from you and hear what is important to you for your city, and we'll move on from there.
Thank you so much. And while we're sort of going to wind down in a minute, I want to acknowledge that we've seen a number of things in the chat that were asking for personal legal help or advice, and that's not something that we can do or give. So if that's something that you wrote to us about, that's not something that we can share with you. So I apologize if you're not receiving an answer there. Okay, I'm seeing a bunch of things in the chat. Let me see. There was another question about internal affairs, which we did investigate. Okay, so I'm seeing some questions that are sort of also suggestions. There's questions asking about whether we can, and suggestions about detasking the police, specialized units. And so I'm not responding to them right now, but those sorts of specifics are the kind of things it's really helpful for us to hear feedback on. So by all means, send them to us in the chat and continue writing to us about them, whether it's in the form of questions or in the form of thought that you have and you think that we should know about.
Yeah, I'll say something about that. Just having worked on developing remedies in other cities and implementing remedies in other cities, some of the requirements have come directly from community groups who can provide important perspective on what they think will work and what they think is a necessary change that needs to be made. And so I will say we take these very seriously. We look very closely at what people think and say should happen. And where possible and where it is an appropriate remedy, we do try to incorporate that as much as we can. And so I really do encourage you to think about the kinds of things, the kinds of requirements, the kinds of safeguards that you think would be useful here, that you think would address the violations that we've described in our report and tonight.
Great. And this might be our last question. Oh, thank you for putting the inbox in the chat, Kelsey. So our email and phone number right there. Someone asked, can you help us work with the state? We passed these ordinances here and then the state struck them down. Suraj, do you want to take this?
Yes. So our case and our investigation found violations of federal law and the Constitution. And federal law is a floor, not a ceiling. And the rights that we describe in the report are fundamental rights that everyone is entitled to. We have brought cases all over the country, and we've found that we're able to navigate the particular context of any state, because every state has different, legal limits and rules and standards. But the standards that we're talking about are under the Constitution and the Americans with Disabilities Act and other civil rights laws. And so we found that we've been able to make sure that people's federal, constitutional, and civil rights are protected. And that's what we intend to do in this case.
Thank you so much. Well, great. Thank you all for joining us and speaking with us. I'll turn it over to Mo for the final remarks. But again, I mean, if I can leave you with anything, it's that this isn't your last chance to talk with us. I hope to see many of you next week.
Thanks, Kit. And yes, thank you all for joining us. It's really something to see so many people come out in the evening to hear from us. And we look forward to hearing more from you and working with you going forward. We also thank you so much for your participation in our investigation. It's been really essential for us to understand what is happening in Memphis. We'll be conducting more outreach over the next few weeks. As Kit mentioned, we're setting up a meeting next week, and we'll be emailing more information about that in-person community meeting. So in addition, feel free to send us emails to our community inbox or a phone call, and we will you'll get updated about future events. We know that many of you have already and for many years been deeply involved in issues relating to public safety and police accountability long before our investigation and our findings report, and we want to thank you for that commitment. I also want to ask for your continued support in the form of sharing information with us. Again, the remedial measures that we put in the end of our report are just a starting point, and ultimately it is your public safety system. It is your police department, and you should have a say in what it looks like. We need to hear from you. The city needs to hear from you, and we want to build on the proposed remedial measures to create a comprehensive and effective reform that will improve public safety and also protect the rights of everyone in Memphis. As I said before, we'll be conducting outreach over the next few weeks and beyond, and we look forward to meeting with you and hearing more from you. But thank you again for joining us tonight, and we hope you have a good evening.